The sun reached its peak at midday as a gentle late winter breeze danced the branches of the trees throughout Granada, the former capital of the Nasrid Emirate. Its final ruler, Muhammad XII, standing atop a nearby pass in the Sierra Nevada mountains, gazed over the horizon at his once magnificent city and sighed in despair. "You weep like a woman over what you could not defend as a man." These were allegedly the words of his mother, Aisha al-Hura, in sight of her son's pitiful state. Prior to the capitulation of Granada in 1492 to Queen Isabella of Castile and King Ferdinand of Aragon, the new Catholic monarchs had, in theory, guaranteed the right for their Granadan Muslim and Jewish subjects to freely practice their religion without interference. However, the issue here was that Muhammad, although affirming this treaty in 1491, had nothing to bargain with. He had no failsafe, no way of ensuring that its terms would be upheld by the monarchy and clergy, who had very little to lose diplomatically, and in practice couldn't be held to account. As we shall explore in this video, religious tensions amongst the population combined with the zealous Catholic institutions resulted in the treaty gradually unravelling, leading to the stifling of religious autonomy, numerous rebellions, along with the inevitable tragedy that eventually befell the Andalusian Muslims in the Iberian Peninsula. Initially, the terms of the treaty were upheld, and the Archbishop of Granada, Hernando de Talavera, pushed for a laissez-faire policy towards the Muslims. He hoped that interaction with Catholics would make them understand the supposed error of the Muslim faith and abandon it. However, with his replacement by Cardinal Cisneros in 1499, the Catholic clergy began pushing for harsher and more authoritarian measures to compel the Muslims to embrace Catholicism. According to historian Matthew Carr, the new cardinal sent uncooperative Muslims, especially noblemen, to prison where they suffered maltreatment until they converted. Cisneros ignored warnings from his council that these methods might violate the Treaty of Granada, laying in stark contrast to the more peaceful attempted methods of conversion initiated by Talavera several years before. The more aggressive approach of the cardinal caused a renewed intensification of religious conflicts. As further elaborated on by Matthew Carr, this escalated into an incident in late 1499, where a Muslim woman was being escorted by a constable out of the Albaicin quarter of Granada for interrogation. Whilst passing through the market, she exclaimed that she was being forced to convert to Christianity, and this resulted in the constable being killed by a crowd and the revolt spiralling into an armed rebellion, and what would later become known as the First Rebellion of the Alpujarra. Whilst the uprising in the urbanized areas of Granada were quickly diffused through diplomacy, negotiating their lives in exchange for nominal conversion to Christianity, the insurgency had spread to the countryside. Many of the Muslim inhabitants began revolting against what they regarded as the violation of the terms of the Treaty of Granada. They feared that they would suffer the same forced conversions as the residents of the Albaicin. The Andalusian Muslims were well armed, tactically led, and used the mountainous terrain to their advantage, conducting a devastating campaign of guerrilla warfare against King Ferdinand's soldiers. However, whilst the Granadan rebels inflicted heavy defeats on the Castilian-Aragonese Union, such as at Sierra Bermeja, historian Leonard Harvey notes the Muslims lacked a cohesive central leadership and coherent strategy. This was due in part to the previous Castilian policy of encouraging the Granada upper class to leave the country or convert in order to keep their privileges. Thus, the rebels' lack of strategic command meant that they were effectively defeated in each area separately by Ferdinand's forces. Towns which surrendered when Ferdinand's army arrived were spared, but those which didn't were often massacred, such as at Laujar de Andarax, where up to 600 women and children who had taken shelter in the local masjid were killed in a gunpowder explosion. Harvey and Carr both concur that by the end of 1501, the rebellion was put down. After successive military defeats, the Muslims no longer had the willpower or resources necessary to continue the uprising. Furthermore, their rights provided by the Treaty of Granada in 1491 were officially repealed, and they were given the choice of either being baptized or being exiled. Given the expensive fee deliberately exacted for passage out of Spain, baptism was the only realistic option for them. Therefore, only a decade after the fall of the Emirate, the entire Muslim population of Granada had nominally converted to Catholicism. It is worth pointing out that the First War of the Albuharra was an interesting historical case of a well-armed, tactically led force being defeated in detail, a military tactic of bringing a large portion of one's own force to bear on small enemy units successively in sequence, rather than engaging the bulk of the enemy force all at once. This often happens whereby a defending unit has no effective communication with its command structure and is thus unable to relay advances on the battlefield in time and request reinforcements. It is also further worsened when the defending force lacks a cohesive leadership or strategy, and one could argue that this happened to a degree during the conquest of the Iberian Muslim Taifa kingdoms, whereby, due to their own political infighting, as well as a lack of unity and organized approach on behalf of the Muslim realms, they were successively divided and conquered, and were thus often unable to mount an offensive defense of many of their own cities. Furthermore, the forced conversion of Muslims to Christianity was not exclusive to the Crown of Castile, nor was it exclusive to Muslims. In December 1496, for example, the Crown of Portugal issued an edict to eradicate both its Muslim and Jewish population. Unlike the Muslims, however, the Jews were forbidden from leaving the country. They had the choice to convert or die, and many who nominally converted were burnt at the stake in 1506, during what later became known as the Easter Massacres. Likewise, in 1492, shortly after the capitulation of Granada, the Alhambra decree, issued by the Crown of Castile, dictated that the entire Jewish population of the city of Granada were to be forced to either convert to Catholicism or go into exile. The Jewish population of Spain were, along with the Muslims, among the key targets of the Inquisition throughout the 16th century. A key development that occurred in 1502 following the defeat of the Albuharra uprising was a proclamation that extended the forced conversions throughout the rest of Castile. Even though those outside of Granada had nothing to do with the rebellion, the edict was clearly designed in order to prevent the Muslims from doing anything other than converting to Christianity. They were explicitly prevented from migrating to other Iberian realms such as the Crown of Aragon, Navarre and Catalonia. Likewise, migration to the Ottoman Empire was also prohibited. Harvey notes that with this edict in such a summary fashion, at such short notice, Muslim presence under the Castilian crown had come to an end. The Treaty of Granada was de facto meaningless at this point, and when Navarre was annexed by Castile in 1515, the policies of the Inquisition were extended to Muslims living there. L.P. Harvey goes on to point out that despite presiding over the conversions of Muslims in his wife Isabella's Castilian lands, Ferdinand II of Aragon did not extend the conversions to his own Aragonese subjects. Kings of Aragon, including Ferdinand, were required to swear an oath at their coronation to not forcibly convert their Muslim subjects. He repeated the same oath to his estates in 1510, and throughout his life he was unwilling to break it. Ferdinand died in 1516 and was succeeded by his grandson, Charles V, who also swore the same oath at his coronation. However, the first wave of forced conversions in Aragon occurred during the 1520s, where an anti-Muslim artisan revolt known as the Revolt of the Brotherhoods broke out. Muslim landowners and peasants alike played a crucial role in key battles, helping the crown to crush the uprising. Nonetheless, Charles V, under pressure from his Catholic clergy, upheld the forced conversions which took place. Simultaneously, he also sought the approval from Pope Clement VII to release himself from an oath which he swore to protect the Aragonese Muslims. Finally, on November 25, 1525, Charles issued an edict ordering the expulsion or conversion of remaining Muslims in the Crown of Aragon. Harvey notes that similar to the case in Castile, even though the option of exile was available on paper, in practice it was almost impossible. In order to leave the realm, a Muslim would have had to obtain documentation from Aragon's western border, then travel inland across the entire breadth of Castile in order to embark by sea from Galicia in the northwest coast, and those who failed to do so would risk enslavement. Before continuing, I think it's worth briefly exploring why these anti-Muslim and anti-Jewish policies were being implemented in the first place across the Iberian Peninsula, and why the Catholic rulers made it extremely difficult for Muslims to leave the region at all. Now, Dr. Muhammad Balan notes how a common mistake that people often make when analysing history is viewing the conquest of Al-Andalus by the Catholic monarchs purely in terms of the Reconquista, and as something exclusive to the Iberian Peninsula. But in reality, it encompassed far more than this. The religious policies implemented by the Catholic clergy were not merely about bringing the peninsula under Catholic rule, but were also about the eradication of Islam itself from the region, with a view to spread these inquisitorial policies to North Africa as well. It was rooted in the belief that Christendom, as a monolithic entity, ought to devote its efforts to not just bringing more land under Catholic rule, but the eventual destruction of Islam itself. Thus, whether this process employed a peaceful means of conversion, such as those favoured by Archbishop Hernando de Talavera, or a more militantly aggressive approach like that of Archbishop Cisneros, they were both viewed as legitimate and necessary steps in accomplishing this goal. This millenarianism, rooted as much in long-standing messianic ideals as well as the political transformations occurring in the Mediterranean since the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople in 1453, manifested itself in the papal-sanctioned Spanish Crusade against North Africa, which was actively undertaken by the Catholic monarchs in the first part of the 16th century. The Reconquista, it would then seem, was not a proto-nationalistic struggle limited to the Iberian Peninsula, but extended across the Straits of Gibraltar into North Africa and beyond. In summary, Dr. Balan notes that the process was politically motivated and had far more to do with the process of state building, the relationship between clergy and state power, and the homogenization of the polity in early Western Europe than any inherent propensity of Catholicism itself for violence. Nonetheless, these expansionist goals of the Spanish Empire in North Africa were eventually thwarted by the Ottoman navy during the reign of Suleiman I in the 16th century. This war for hegemony over North Africa culminated in key Ottoman victories, such as the Battle of Prevez in 1538, Algiers in 1541, Jerba in 1560, and finally Tunis in 1574. I'd also like to take a moment to discuss what the Muslim response was to these religious policies put in place by the Iberian crowns. Traditionally, the predominant position of Islamic law was that Muslims were not allowed to permanently reside in land which prevented them from practicing their religion, and thus, the perspective of contemporary scholars such as Ahmad ibn Yahya al-Wanshari was that the Iberian Muslims were obligated to emigrate to Muslim land in North Africa and the Ottoman Empire. However, as discussed, the Castilian crown was well aware of this. They had put measures into place which sought to make it in practice extremely difficult for the Muslims to leave the peninsula. The only way this could be done was through paying hefty fees, which most citizens could not afford. Thus, aside from a few Muslims who were able to escape, almost all of them had to nominally convert to Catholicism. It could be argued then that the Castilian crown during the early 1500s wanted to have their cake and eat it too. On one hand, they wanted to pursue a policy of strict conformity to Catholicism throughout their realms, but at the same time they didn't want to have to expel their Muslim subjects to do so. This was because they made up a key component of their overall population and played a major role in agriculture and taxation. This resulted in what would later be known as the Oran Fatwa of 1504, an Islamic legal ruling issued by Maghrebi scholar Ahmad ibn Abi Jumma, which set out detailed relaxations of Islamic requirements, allowing Muslims to conform outwardly to Christianity and perform acts that were ordinarily forbidden when necessary to survive. For the crypto-Muslims, or Moriscos as they came to be known, rules regarding ablution, prayer, blasphemy, and the consumption of pork and wine in the presence of their Catholic rulers were relaxed. According to L.P. Harvey, the Oran Fatwa, which enjoyed widespread currency amongst the hundreds of thousands of Muslims forced to remain in the peninsula, became the theological basis for studying Spanish Islam during the 16th century. It is also worth noting that crypto-Islam was not the only response of Muslims in the peninsula who who were not wealthy enough to leave. Some, such as those within the Crown of Aragon, took up armed resistance against these aggressive anti-Muslim policies. For example, in the Sierra de Espadan mountain range, under the leadership of Selim al-Manzo, the Muslim insurgency held out for several months before eventually collapsing and being forced to convert to Catholicism. By the 1520s, although most Muslims were nominally Christian throughout the peninsula, many still therefore continued to practice their faith in secret, and even those that were unable to do this held on to their customs and dress as well as their Andalusian dialect of Arabic. Hence, to bolster religious conformity, Emperor Charles V issued the Edict of 1526, which sought to more harshly enforce these laws against the Moriscos. However, the Moriscos managed to get this edict suspended for 40 years by the payment of 80,000 ducats. But once this term had expired, the Archbishop of Granada, convinced that the Muslims were maintaining their customs and traditions and would never become real Christians, called in 1565 a synod of the bishops. It was agreed that the policy of persuasion should be replaced by one of repression, and that the measures of 1526 should now be applied. This necessitated the prohibition of all distinctive Morisco practices: language, clothing, public baths, and religious ceremonies. Houses were to be regularly inspected, and their sons could be taken to Old Castile at the cost of their parents, to be brought up learning Christian customs and forgetting those of their origins. The crypto-Muslims once again tried to negotiate this, but Philip II was far less flexible than his predecessor. As the American historian Henry Charles Lee noted, the Moriscos had come to the parting of the ways. There was no middle course, and they had the naked alternative of submission or rebellion. As the failure of their appeals became evident, the Moriscos of Granada began to prepare for a second major rebellion, holding secret meetings in the old Muslim quarter, the Albaicin. Food stocks and supplies were stored in caves dotted around the countryside, and insurgency groups began to once again form. After a year of fruitless negotiations, in 1568 the Morisco leaders in Granada decided to take up arms, and thus began the Second War of the Alpujarra. During the course of this uprising, thousands of Moriscos openly repudiated Christianity, took up arms against the Spanish government, and sought the aid of the Ottomans. The rebellion was one of the most violent affairs of the 16th century. Various atrocities were committed by the rebels against Christians, including many Andalusians who had embraced Christianity, and priests who were particularly singled out as a symbol of the Inquisition. As a result of this rebellion, Philip II dispatched his half-brother Don Juan of Austria to Granada to pacify the region. The uprising was brutally suppressed after nearly 3 years, and one of his worst atrocities was to raze down the town of Galera to the east of Granada and sprinkle it with salt, having slaughtered 2,500 people, including 400 women and children. Following the rebellion, during which tens of thousands of Moriscos and Old Christians had perished, as many as 80,000 Moriscos from Granada were forcibly deported and dispersed throughout the Kingdom of Castile. Historian Michael B. Barry goes into more detail about the stages throughout the devastating rebellion. Like the first one in 1499, it ended in a failure for the now Andalusi crypto-Muslims. However, it should be noted that it was by no means a victory for the Spanish Empire. The effects of the rebellion and the consequences of the clergy's religious policies were devastating. The deportations of Moriscos from Granada which followed took a drastic toll on the region's economy. Many fields lay uncultivated and barren, as orchards and workshops had been destroyed during the fighting. The resettlement program never restored the Alpujarra population to anything like its former numbers. Before the rebellion, the Alpujarra probably had a population of around 40,000, mainly Morisco Muslims with a few Old Christians. The War of 1568-71 and the subsequent expulsion left only a handful of newly converted Christians. These were estimated to number just over 200 families in the entire region. The population had fallen drastically and recovered incredibly slowly. Nevertheless, for the Moriscos, the worst was still yet to come. Before continuing, I think it is also worth exploring the geopolitical context surrounding the religious policies implemented by the Inquisition and the ramifications that they had. During the period of intensified religious suppression, Many Muslims who fled to North Africa during the early 16th century rose to prominence as Barbary corsairs, acting as privateers in service to Constantinople. As Dr. Balan notes, the establishment of an Ottoman naval base around 1529 in Algiers, across the straits from Iberia, certainly strengthened the perception that the Ottomans would deliver the Andalusians from their predicament. The alliance between the Ottomans in North Africa and the Iberian Muslim refugees residing there underscored this association between Ottoman involvement and the Morisco cause. Indeed, legendary Ottoman Admiral Hayreddin Barbarossa's transport of 70,000 Moriscos in 1529 alone increased this apocalyptic perception of Ottoman power among some Andalusis and were viewed as the realization of their hopes for deliverance. Thus, the swift change in policies implemented by the Spanish Empire during the latter half of the 16th century may have, in some part, been motivated by security concerns regarding the Ottoman navy. However, at the same time, the Council of Aragon noted that this threat had long since passed by the end of the 16th century, and the crypto-Muslims had no weapons nor fortified areas to harbour Ottoman ships. That said, following the rebellion of 1568 to 1571 in Granada, religious tensions still continued to exist in other parts of Spain, most notably in the Crown of Aragon, where crypto-Muslims still made up a significant portion of the population in areas like Valencia. In addition to this, the loss of Spain's holdings in the Low Countries to the new Dutch Republic, combined with a 1604 financial recession, resulted in a reduction in the standard of living. This inevitably led to increased tension between the Moriscos and Old Christians for precious jobs, and these tensions were in fact facilitated by a famine during the late 16th century. Finally, on the 9th of April 1609, an edict was passed to expel all of the remaining Moriscos from the Iberian Peninsula. The Andalusis would be allowed to take anything that they could carry, but their homes and land would pass into the hands of their masters. Burning or other destruction of their homes before the transfer was prohibited on pain of death. The Valencian aristocracy met with the government to protest the expulsion, as losing their workers would ruin their agricultural incomes. The government offered some of the confiscated property and territory of the Moriscos to them in exchange, but this didn't come close to compensating for the loss. On the 30th of September, the first of the exiles were taken to the ports, where, as a final insult, they were forced to pay for their own fare for the trip. The Moriscos were transported to North Africa, where at times they were attacked as invaders by the people of the recipient countries. Other times, small revolts broke out on the ships, causing some of the exiles to be slain in battle with the crew. It is incredibly difficult to gauge the total number of Moriscos expelled by the Spanish Empire between 1609 and 1614. However, estimates generally range from 300 to 600,000. As noted by John Lynch, the Council of Castile evaluated the expulsion in 1619 and concluded that it had no economic impact for the country. This was basically true for Castile, as some scholars of the expulsion have found no economic consequences on sectors where the Morisco population was important. However, in the Kingdom of Valencia, fields were abandoned and a vacuum was left in sectors of the economy that the Christians could not possibly fill. With the removal of 33% of the inhabitants of Valencia, some countries in the north of the current Alicante province lost virtually their entire population. The infrastructure decayed, and the Christian nobles and landlords fell into arrears. Strapped for cash, many of the Valencian nobles increased rents on their Christian tenants to get even close to the previous income, and the increase in rents drove off any new tenants from coming to replace them, and as a result, agricultural output in Valencia dropped tremendously. To conclude, as Dr. Balan notes, the expulsion of the Moriscos has been characterized by several scholars and historians as an example of systematic ethnic and religious cleansing, which should be seen in light of the broader context of the homogenization of states in early modern Europe. Despite the predominance of the national narrative of the Reconquista that emphasizes the supposed foreignness of the Iberian Muslims in order to paint a picture of an embattled and indigenous Christian society fighting against a brutal ruling caste of foreign Muslim conquerors, an 800-year struggle that culminated in the latter being legitimately conquered, converted and expelled back to Africa, the reality was far more complicated. Even a basic study of the demographics, culture, and society of medieval Iberia demonstrates that a substantial component Even the majority, according to some historians, of the Muslims in Spain and Portugal were actually indigenous to the country, or more accurately, as indigenous as those peoples who came to be known as Castilians, Catalans and Portuguese. The dozen different ethnic and linguistic groups were eventually homogenized to a single coherent unit during the course of early modern history. The suppression of Iberia's Muslim and Jewish heritage was also part of this process. It is in this broader context that the term Moor becomes particularly problematic and seeks to obscure the Iberian heritage of Andalusian Muslims. It is here that we once again recount another recollection of an Andalusian, this time the translator Ahmad ibn Qasim al-Hajri, where he recalls a conversation he had with the ruler of the Netherlands, Prince Maurice. The prince asked, "Let us say that we were to establish an agreement with the Moroccan Sultan of Marrakesh and the Grand Signior, by whom I mean the Supreme Sultan of Constantinople, the ruler of Islam and the faith, to coordinate our assault against the King of Spain and conquer the peninsula. Would this work?" To which Al-Hajri replied, "This would indeed be an auspicious affair if it should come to pass, but it is highly doubtful that it could be achieved. But if such a thing were to occur, then they would indeed be able to conquer Spain. May God return it to the fold of Islam."